The power of love, the mysterious thing. So I think we're going to think a little bit about how the power of love can transform our moments. Something has to change in the midst of our world. This poem that Peter read, how many of you all had heard this poem before? Just show of hands, just curious. Really, second coming. You might have even heard of it more than you realize because Joni Mitchell made it famous back in the 60s when she sang her song Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And in fact, as I'm listening to him read it, I keep hearing her singing, Slouching Towards Bethlehem to be born. I just keep hearing her singing that song. It's an interesting poem, and the critics, literary critics, it's interesting what they say about this poem. It's probably the most utilized poem of all of our classic poetry, but it's the least known in terms of high school anthologies. All the Robert Frost poems, all the Herman Melville, everything, all those classic poems that are there, this one is never there. The Second Coming is not included in there. It's always interesting why it's not, and yet it is the title of so many books, the title of so many songs. You'll see the phrases. If you just look at those phrases, you'll recognize them, you'll hear them. They are such succinct metaphors for the reality of our lives. When Linda and I were in Strasbourg this last 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were with this church cruise, this Rhine River cruise, we were in Strasbourg the morning after the bombing and attacks in Paris. It happened during the night while we were in the boat. I got a text about 2:33 in the morning from one of our sons, from Matthew, and of course texting and all of that, internet and Wi-Fi and whatnot was iffy throughout the whole trip. But here came this text, woke me up in the middle of the night, and it just had in big capital letters, "Are you guys okay?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. I texted back and went, "Yeah, good night." And he texted back and said, "Did you hear what happened?" And I was like, "No." And then it just said bombing in Paris. So I quickly got on Google and got on the Wi-Fi and found out what had happened. The next morning on this ship, it's about 150 people. It's a small ship. And I expected this fury, this sort of hustle and bustle and anxiety and whatnot. And it was very, very quiet in the morning. And then there was an announcement from the cruise director over the intercom which said, if you'd heard, many of you have already asked us about this, but if you've heard, and then he mentioned what had happened, then he said, "We're going about our tour as normal. You may be asked for a driver's license as we cross into France today." And that's all. So we went to Strasbourg that next morning. And we hung out, and we noticed that there were security people, and there were the French high security. I don't remember what their term is called, but it's sort of like our Rangers or our Special Forces. And they were walking around, and I heard one of them ask them, "I guess you're here because of what had happened?" And they said, "No, we've been here since January." They'd been out in public since the January bombings of the news media site Charlie Hebdo, and I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I think, but that happened in January. They've been around since then. There didn't seem to be any real anxiety, which kind of worried me, that nobody seemed to be too anxious. Everybody was going about their daily business. But as the week wore on, we got more news, right? And then we had the announcement from President Hollande, who had said that they're shutting down borders, and then later Brussels had shut down refugees entering, and so things began to happen. And on the last day, which was a week and 2 days or so afterwards, we were in Amsterdam, which is an enormous city, right? And it's completely international. And there are 150 different races, or ethnic groups, nationalities represented in that city. The place is just a bustling international complex and just packed. Every corner a concentration of thousands of people. So naturally, you're just assuming at any given moment something's going to happen. And some of us are just sort of adopting and living with this new sense of terror around us. I fought it myself. I fought my own sense of terror. I thought, I'm in Amsterdam. I'm not going to miss an opportunity to experience this amazing city. And as the night wore on and it got a little bit later, the rain started to fall, and Linda's with me, and Linda, being the more pragmatic of the two of us, is saying, shouldn't we get back to the boat? And I'm saying, aren't we having fun? And she says, we need to get back to the boat. And I said, you know what, it's not hard to get back to the boat. She's anxious that we're in this massive city. We've said goodbye to our tour guide. We're on our own. We're remembering our son, who's quite adventurous, and says, you'll love it, just have fun wandering around. But then he reminded me that if you follow the canals, they all lead back to the main canal. All the main streets, everything leads back to the canal. You can't get too lost. But there we were, and we went to the square where they were setting up for this massive Christmas celebration that has since been canceled because of the public, public arenas and things being a risk. But we watched them setting it up, and it was just fascinating. The aerial dancers, music, they were rehearsing, and I stood there, and Linda's like, you know, this is not a good place to be standing. And I said, no, this is really exciting. Look at this and all the costumes, and she convinced me, and we went to the train station. And I'm thinking, well, that's a safe place, right? Train station. The train station in Amsterdam is renowned for its shops. It is a fascinating mall of shops and people and demonstrations and music. And so we went there walking because it was raining, and it was on the way back to the boat. And as we were walking along, I kept hearing something playing that I recognized, some music. And we saw the guards all looking around and kind of keeping a close eye on people, and Linda was anxious and kind of moving. And I said, no, I hear something. She said, you hear the radio, let's go. And I said, no, I hear something. And we walked toward a door where there was a grand piano. Apparently, there's a grand piano that's always there at the train station. I'm thinking that's a wonderful idea to have that out in public. Anyone can come along and start playing. And there was a group of what looked like Eastern Europeans. I didn't recognize the language. It wasn't German. It certainly wasn't French, but it sounded maybe like Bosnian or Ukrainian. It sounded East European. And they were all singing. They were all young adults, maybe 20 of them, and they were all singing this song. And then they sang it in English. You got to be bold. You got to be strong. You got to be wiser. Yeah. You know this song? Desiree, you got to be. Love will win the day. I kept listening to them singing. They were singing in their own language, but then they'd sing that part in English. And I said, Linda, listen to what they're singing. And for just a moment, we stopped because we realized what they were doing was singing a song in defiance of their fear, in defiance of the fear around them. And then we went back to the boat. It's interesting when you look at the Nativity to realize what's really going on in the Nativity story. We don't think about it because we're so used to the cute little plays that we put on every year, the Nativity dramas, the Nativity sort of experience that we go through every 4 weeks in Advent as we lead up to Christmas. We don't really think about what's going on there. We know most of the characters, right? We got the shepherds. They're not all the same in all the stories, but we know if we combine all the stories, we got different ones. But we got the shepherds, we got the wise people, we got Mary and Joseph. Who else? Who else?
Baby Jesus.
Little drummer boy.
Little drummer boy, Santa's in there. Yeah, okay. Who else is? Animals, sheep, donkey.
Okay.
Sometimes cattle. What else?
Baby.
There's the baby Jesus. Don't want to forget him. The angels. Don't want to forget them. They're there. Although, yeah, they're kind of there up above. Yeah, they're there. Who else? Anybody? Who else? The three kings, the wise men, the magi. They're there.
The innkeeper, but
by default, he's off to the side. That's right. Yeah, he's back at the building going like, yeah, I feel so bad. We always forget this other one. What? We always forget the main character of this story. Okay, God's a good character. God's important. Thank you. That's right. I didn't want to forget God. God's very important in this, but we always forget the real reason for the story. Do we know? You know. We were in the training program together. And you preach basically the same thing. The Roman Empire. The reality, the big guys, the big shots, the one who call the shots, the people who rule the day. They play the most significant role in the whole thing, and we never think about it. Because in reality, it's not really that easy to think about. It's not really that comfortable. If you look at Luke's gospel, he intentionally brings them into the picture. So he creates this whole scenario that Mark doesn't talk about, the earliest gospel. Mark doesn't mention anything about the birth narratives. And Paul, the earliest writer in the Christian church, doesn't mention anything about the birth or about the narrative stories. Matthew picks up off of Luke and gets some things and then kind of takes it a little different direction. John comes much later in time, back towards the first part of the 2nd century, and he's off into sort of a Gnostic, mystical kind of interpretation of the whole thing. Luke has very specific reasons for how he wrote this gospel. So he combines some things that a lot of scholars will say probably didn't happen at that time. Quirinius probably wasn't really the governor at that time. He comes about 10 years later. But it's important to put him in Bethlehem, whereas others have him in Nazareth. And it's important to have him in Bethlehem because it sets the tone for the whole story. Who else is called Son of God? Augustus. The Roman Empire is announced with heavenly announcement or godly announcement or otherworldly announcement and proclaimed Son of God. And Luke has said, no, that's not who Son of God is. This is who Son of God is. This is what the kingdom of God is. In contrast to the ruling power, Augustus, you remember we've talked about this in here before. Augustus' way is piety, victory in war, and peace. That's the path of Roman Empire. Piety, following the rules specifically. Victory in war, you get peace. It's by control. So why do we register people? So we can control people. Get the taxes, know who's who. It's a contrast to the reality, the main character, the powers that be. That story to me says so much more than simply the birth of a baby and God coming in the form of a child. And that's where we sometimes miss it. And that's where we sometimes don't really see nativity. We see cuteness, we see sweetness, we see God's love. We forget the kingdom of God is all about restorative, redemptive justice. That's its primary message. And if you look at Jesus' life, that was Jesus' primary message. It's hard. It's a hard one sometimes, I think, to swallow. And this poem to me, I think, as Peter read it this morning, I think it speaks so clearly, not just to what was going on in 1920 when Yeats wrote this poem, not just the First World War, but the reality that we still, every generation, seems to be in the midst of this apocalyptic kind of presence, this apocalyptic sort of reality around us where powers are always vying against powers, where someone is always trying to take control of someone else, where fear is at every corner. And the falcon cannot hear the falconer anymore. And it becomes difficult for even the innocents to find their way. And then he says at the end, the end of the first stanza, the best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And isn't that what we often see, even to this day? This idea of the second coming, of the birth of Jesus, not simply as a historical moment in which God decides to come into the world, but as a profound moment in which God announces to the world there is a different way of living. A way in which we sometimes get glimpses of it in history, which we saw in Anne Frank when we went to the Anne Frank house and stumbled in there by accident, and there she was living in the midst of this oppression, and yet somehow still seeing the best, even in her oppressor. That at some point, she says in her writing, at some point we will be free of this and we will remember who Germans really are and what Germany really is. She had this hope beyond hope, where people, she says, will see each other not for their religion, but for their humanity. She says this 14-year-old in the midst of her oppression after 3 years, not but a month before she's arrested and taken to the camps. We see this in the guy that is called Tank Guy. Do you know who I'm talking about? Tank guy in 1989. I'm going to remember the date. I'm going to forget the date exactly. Tiananmen Square, the student that stood in front of the tanks, right? Don't really know his name. We're not really sure who he is. That's what he's called, Tank Guy. He's known that, Google him. There's wonderful articles all about him. It happened in 1989, June 5th. And as he stood there, he stood in front of the tanks. They lined up in front of him, one behind the other, four of them, and he would move when they would move, and he just stood there with his little grocery bag or his little shopping bag, and he then would step in again until finally the commander in the first tank came out, and he jumped up onto the turret. They're talking. He goes back in, then he runs around to the gunner on the backside, talks to the gunner. The tank starts to roll. He runs back out in front. And this goes on for some time until finally some people come out from the side, and nobody's sure exactly who they were or what happened to the guy. There's absolutely no record. It's true for so many characters. It's true in our own day, as earlier this week, a group of 100 people stood outside across the street of the mosque over in Irving, and stood out there with their signs just to let you know you're loved. Because they'd had a protest earlier in the week with people actually with guns there who were angry and frightened and afraid, and so they came out in counter-protest. Where do we see signs of nativity? I'm not saying don't be scared. I'm not saying we don't have a right to be afraid. I'm saying, what's the response of the kingdom? What does it mean to see nativity? I think for me, my biggest anxiety as I look and get ready in the season of Advent, my biggest anxiety is that I'm going to wander through these 4 weeks like I always do, and I'm going to busy myself slouching through shopping and slouching through the Christmas decorations and slouching through the gathering of relatives and slouching all the way down to Christmas Eve where I celebrate in the candles and we sing Silent Night, and it's a beautiful, warming experience, and then I'll look at the nativity and see nothing but a baby. That's what I'm worried about myself. Honestly, that's what I think has to change. At least I know it has to change for me. Because the nativity is not simply an event as much as it is also a mirror, a chance to think about what's being born in me, what's being born in each of us that reveals God's presence in the world. What is the response of God's love? In fact, it's not easy. It'd be a lot easier just to get behind some guns and get behind our fear. It really is a lot easier. But that's not what the nativity is about. And that's the challenge, I think, for us this season. Something has to change. Amen.